September 28th, 1874. Palo Duro Canyon, Texas Panhandle. The warrior couldn't believe what he was seeing. From his position on the canyon rim, 800 feet above the valley floor, he watched as a long blue line of soldiers descended the narrow trail below, dozens of them, then hundreds. Their horses sliding on loose rock, the animals whinnying in protest as cavalrymen led them down single file into what the Comanche had always believed was their impregnable sanctuary. The morning sun illuminated the canyon walls in brilliant reds and oranges, the same colors his people had watched for generations, the same ancient stone that had sheltered them through countless winters. But now, those walls echoed with sounds that didn't belong. The clink of metal on metal, the creak of saddle leather, the muttered curses of white soldiers as they navigated the treacherous descent. He could smell the cook fires from the village below, breakfast fires. 5 bands had gathered here for the winter: Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne. 200 lodges spread along the canyon floor near the prairie dog town fork of the Red River. 1,500 people, women preparing the morning meal, children playing, warriors still sleeping after a late night council. Everyone believing they were safe here, hidden in the earth's embrace, protected by walls of stone that reached toward the sky. The warrior's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth went dry. He opened his mouth to scream a warning, but his throat seized. The soldiers were already halfway down, too many of them, 3 columns moving through the canyon from different directions. He could see their faces now in the strengthening light. Grim, determined, led by the officer the Comanche called Bad Hand, the one with the ruined fingers from an old war wound, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie of the 4th Cavalry, the man who never stopped hunting them. Down below, the first lodges were waking. A dog barked, then another. The warriors heard them too and emerged from their buffalo hide lodges, squinting into the dawn light, searching for the source of the disturbance. Then they saw what he saw. The blue coats, hundreds of them already on the canyon floor, already forming a line, already beginning their charge. The warrior finally found his voice. His war cry split the morning air, high and piercing, a sound of warning and rage and desperation all mixed together. Other voices joined his from the canyon rim. Women screaming, children crying, warriors shouting orders. The crack of rifles echoed off the stone walls as the Comanche grabbed their weapons and ran to meet the attack. Smoke began to fill the narrow canyon as gunfire erupted from both sides. The air smelled like sulfur and fear. But the warrior on the rim knew the truth that those below hadn't realized yet. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a battle they could win and withdraw from. This was something else entirely. Something new and terrible. The white soldiers weren't trying to drive them away. They were trying to destroy them completely, forever. He watched as cavalry troopers swept through the village, their horses at full gallop. He watched as his people scattered, families running up the canyon with whatever they could carry. He watched as soldiers began torching the lodges, one after another, flames consuming the buffalo hide covers, the winter food stores, the clothing, the tools, everything his people needed to survive. Black smoke rose in thick columns, staining the beautiful morning sky. And beyond the village, he could see what the soldiers really wanted: the horse herd, more than 1,400 animals. The source of Comanche power, the reason his people had ruled these plains for more than a century. Without those horses, they couldn't hunt the buffalo, couldn't raid, couldn't flee, couldn't be Comanche. The warrior understood then what was happening. This was the end, not just of this battle, not just of this band, but of everything. The entire Comanche way of life was dying in that canyon, right now, this morning. While the sun painted the rocks red and the smoke rose toward heaven. How did it come to this? How did the most powerful native tribe in North America, the Lords of Comancheria for 150 years, face total annihilation in a single devastating campaign? Why did the United States government decide that negotiation had failed and only complete military destruction would do? And what happened in this canyon that would break the spirit of a people who had never been broken? Welcome to Valor and Violence. To understand why the United States Army descended into Palo Duro Canyon that September morning, you have to understand what the Comanche had built and what they had become. For more than a century and a half, the Comanche controlled the southern plains with an iron grip. Their territory, which they called Comancheria, stretched from modern-day Kansas south to the Texas Hill Country, from the edge of New Mexico east to the Cross Timbers, 240,000 square miles, bigger than most European nations. And they didn't just occupy this land. They dominated it. They terrorized it. They ruled it. Absolutely. But it wasn't always this way. In the 1600s, the Comanche were nobodies. A weak band of Shoshone pushed out of the Rocky Mountains by stronger tribes. They scratched out a miserable existence on the eastern slopes, bullied and displaced, surviving on whatever they could find. Historian Pekka Hämäläinen writes in his book The Comanche Empire that they were, quote, among the most marginal people in North America, end quote. They had no grand culture, no impressive mythology, no permanent settlements. They were nomads because they had to be, not because they chose to be. Other tribes pushed them around. The Apache, then the dominant power on the southern plains, barely considered them worth fighting. Then everything changed. In the middle of the 1600s, like a gift from the gods, the Comanche discovered the horse. Spanish horses, thousands of them, escaped during the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 when the native peoples of New Mexico drove out their Spanish oppressors and sent their livestock scattering across the plains. Mustangs, bred tough for the harsh Spanish frontier, perfectly suited for life in this unforgiving landscape. While other tribes adopted horses gradually, cautiously, the Comanche embraced them with a fervor that bordered on obsession. They didn't just ride horses, they lived on them. They became part of them. By 1700, the transformation was complete. The Comanche weren't marginal anymore. They were the most feared warriors on the southern plains. George Catlin, the famous artist who painted them in the 1830s, witnessed their horsemanship firsthand and wrote, quote, I am ready without hesitation to pronounce the Comanches the most extraordinary horsemen I have seen yet in all my travels, and I doubt very much whether any people in the world can surpass them, end quote. They could fire arrows with deadly accuracy at full gallop. They could hang off the side of a running horse, using just a heel hook, their bodies completely shielded, shooting beneath the animal's neck. They could reload while riding. They fought entirely mounted when other tribes still dismounted to fight on foot. But the horse gave them more than military superiority. It gave them range. A Comanche war party could cover 70 miles in a day. They could strike deep into Mexico, hundreds of miles from their home territory, raid ranches and villages, and vanish before any pursuit could be organized. They could attack in Texas and be back in Kansas before the Texas Rangers even knew they'd been there. Author S.C. Gwynn writes in his book Empire of the Summer Moon, quote, the Comanche controlled more territory than any other Native American tribe, and they held it longer, end quote. From 1750 to 1850, they were the unquestioned masters of their domain, and they were brutal about it. The Comanche weren't interested in coexistence. They wanted resources, buffalo hunting grounds, raiding opportunities, trade goods. When the Apache tried to hold onto their plains territory, the Comanche drove them out with a ferocity that shocked even the Spanish, who had fought native peoples across 2 continents. By 1780, the Apache had been completely expelled from the plains, forced into the mountains and deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. The Comanche took everything. Then came the collision that would doom them. The Americans. When Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821, they inherited the Comanche problem. And it was a problem. Thousands of Comanche warriors raided deep into Mexican territory, stealing horses and cattle, taking captives, killing anyone who resisted. The Mexican government tried peace treaties. They tried military campaigns. They tried scalp bounties, paying for dead Comanche. Nothing worked. The Comanche were too mobile, too skilled, too powerful. Mexican settlements in Chihuahua and Sonora lived in constant terror. Then, in 1836, Texas won its independence from Mexico. And guess what they inherited? That same Comanche problem. Texans tried negotiation too. They tried establishing boundaries. They tried trade relationships. None of it worked because the Comanche didn't recognize boundaries. They didn't negotiate as a unified tribe. They were organized into independent bands, each led by its own chief, each making its own decisions. A peace treaty with one band meant nothing to another band 50 miles away. And all of them believed that raiding was their right, their way of life, their culture. The Parker Fort Massacre of 1836 showed Texans what they were dealing with. On May 19th, hundreds of Comanche warriors attacked a fortified settlement in what is now Limestone County. They killed 5 men. They captured 5 women and children, including 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker, who would live with the Comanche for 24 years and become the mother of Quanah Parker, the last free Comanche war chief. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through the Texas frontier. Settlers understood then that they were facing an enemy unlike any they'd encountered before. When the United States annexed Texas in 1845, they inherited more than land. They inherited a war, a slow-burning, vicious conflict that had been going on for decades. And then in 1849, the California Gold Rush sent thousands of wagons rolling west across Comanche. Thousands more settlers moving into traditional Comanche hunting grounds, fencing land, killing buffalo, building towns, demanding that the Comanche stop raiding and settle on reservations like civilized people. The Comanche laughed at that idea. Reservations? Farming? That was a life for weak people, for defeated people. The Comanche weren't defeated. They still controlled the plains. They still had their horses. They still had the buffalo herds. So the raids continued and escalated. T.R. Fehrenbach writes in his book Comanches, "The destruction of a people that, quote, between 1835 and 1860, the Comanche and Kiowa killed or captured more than 800 Texans," end quote. 800. And those were just the documented cases. Ranch houses burned, wagon trains ambushed, women and children taken captive. The frontier lived in constant fear of the Comanche moon, the full moon nights when the war parties rode. The U.S. Army tried to bring peace. The Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 promised the Comanche a reservation in Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. 3 million acres, government rations, schools, protection from white encroachment. In exchange, the Comanche would stop raiding. They would let the buffalo hunters work. They would accept civilization. Some Comanche bands agreed. They were tired, sick. Their people were dying from cholera and smallpox brought by the whites. The buffalo herds were thinning. Maybe reservation life was better than starvation. But not all of them agreed. Quanah Parker's Quahati band refused to sign. So did many others. They looked at the reservation Indians and saw them growing fat and lazy on government beef, forgetting how to hunt, forgetting how to fight, forgetting how to be Comanche. That wasn't life. That was death in slow motion. So the Quahati and other holdout bands kept raiding into Texas, into Mexico, taking horses, cattle, anything they wanted. And in 1873 and 74, the tension reached a breaking point. White buffalo hunters were slaughtering the great herds wholesale, taking only the hides and leaving the carcasses to rot. The Comanche watched their entire world being destroyed for profit. 70 million buffalo in 1800, less than 1 million by 1875. Something had to give. And in Washington, generals and politicians decided what that something would be. No more negotiations. No more treaties. The Comanche would submit to reservation life or they would be destroyed. Completely. Utterly. Without mercy. The order came down from Lieutenant General William Sherman and General Philip Sheridan. Sherman, who had burned his way through Georgia during the Civil War, understood total war. He understood that you didn't defeat an enemy by winning battles. You defeated them by destroying their ability to make war, their supplies, their resources, their will to fight. That's what the Red River War of 1874 was designed to do. 5 columns of cavalry, 3,000 soldiers, Tonkawa and Apache scouts who hated the Comanche as much as the whites did. The strategy was simple. Find the Comanche camps, destroy everything, burn their lodges, take their horses, kill their buffalo, chase them through the winter when they were most vulnerable. Give them no rest, no sanctuary, no hope. And leading one of those columns was Colonel Ranald Mackenzie, commanding the 4th Cavalry out of Fort Concho, Texas. President Grant called him, quote, the most promising young officer in the Army, end quote. Mackenzie was 34 years old, a veteran of the Civil War where he'd been wounded 6 times and lost 2 fingers from his right hand, giving him the nickname Bad Hand among the Indians. He'd already led successful campaigns against the Kickapoo in Mexico and the Comanche in Texas. He was smart, aggressive, and absolutely ruthless when he needed to be. In September of 1874, Mackenzie's Tonkawa scouts brought him intelligence. The main Comanche encampment, 5 bands together, hundreds of lodges, hidden in a massive canyon in the Texas Panhandle, a place called Palo Duro. It was the opportunity Mackenzie had been waiting for, the chance to end the Comanche threat forever. On September 26th, his scouts confirmed the location. The canyon was there, the Comanche were there, vulnerable, unsuspecting. Mackenzie gave the order. They would attack at dawn. The breaking point came at a place called Adobe Walls. June 27th, 1874. A tiny trading post in the Texas Panhandle, nothing more than a handful of sod buildings where buffalo hunters bought supplies and sold hides. 28 white men and 1 woman were there that morning when Quanah Parker led a war party of 250 Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne warriors in a massive assault designed to drive the hide hunters from Comanche territory forever. It should have been a massacre. The hunters were outnumbered almost 10 to 1, but they had something the warriors didn't expect. Big 50 Sharps rifles, 50 caliber buffalo guns that could drop a bison at 1,000 yards. And these weren't farmers or settlers. These were professional hunters, men who made their living with precision shooting. The battle lasted 3 days. When it was over, 13 warriors lay dead. Only 4 whites were killed. Quanah Parker himself took a bullet that nearly killed him, the round ricocheting off his horse and slamming into his shoulder. The war party retreated, defeated, and humiliated. One hunter, Billy Dixon, made a shot that became legendary. 1,500 yards, nearly a mile. He knocked a warrior off his horse on a distant bluff. The Indians called it the shot that killed our spirits. Adobe Walls proved something the Comanche hadn't wanted to believe. The technology gap had become too wide. The whites had weapons that made traditional warfare obsolete. But more than that, Adobe Walls gave the U.S. government the excuse it needed. The reservation Comanche, the peaceful ones who'd signed treaties, had stayed out of the fight. But the Army didn't care anymore about those distinctions. General Philip Sheridan, commanding the military division of the Missouri, saw Adobe Walls as proof that the holdout bands would never stop raiding, never accept peace, never submit to civilization. Sheridan went to his superior, Lieutenant General William Sherman. And Sherman, the man who'd pioneered total war during his march through Georgia, gave Sheridan exactly what he wanted. Authorization for a winter campaign. No restrictions, no negotiations. Hunt down every Comanche who refused reservation life and force them to surrender or die trying. The strategy was brutal in its simplicity. 5 columns of cavalry would converge on the Texas Panhandle from different directions, creating a tightening noose. Colonel Nelson Miles from Fort Dodge, Kansas. Major William Price from Fort Union, New Mexico. Lieutenant Colonel John Davidson from Fort Sill, Indian Territory. Lieutenant Colonel George Buell from Fort Griffin, Texas. And Colonel Ranald Mackenzie from Fort Concho, Texas. 3,000 soldiers total. They would sweep the plains, find the Comanche camps, and destroy them. Not just defeat them, destroy them. Sheridan's orders were explicit. Quote, drive them from their winter camps. Destroy their villages and ponies. Kill or hang all warriors. Bring back all women and children, end quote. This wasn't about winning battles. It was about breaking the Comanche will to resist, taking everything they needed to survive as free people. The campaign began in September of 1874 as the weather turned cool and the grass on the plains began to brown. This timing was deliberate. Winter was when the Comanche were most vulnerable. Their horses were weak from lack of good forage. Their camps were stationary, huddled in protected canyons to escape the brutal plains winds. They couldn't move quickly or far. They were, for the first time in their history, sitting targets. Colonel Mackenzie understood this better than anyone. At 34 years old, he'd already established a reputation as one of the Army's most effective Indian fighters. His men called him the Perpetual Punisher. The Indians called him Bad Hand, referring to the mangled fingers on his right hand, legacy of a Civil War wound. He'd lost those fingers at Petersburg in 1864, shot while leading a charge against Confederate positions. The injury had done nothing to slow him down. Mackenzie was different from the typical frontier officer. He was a West Point graduate, top of his class, brilliant with tactics and strategy, but he also understood the brutality required for this kind of warfare. In 1873, he'd led an unauthorized raid into Mexico, crossing the Rio Grande to destroy a Kickapoo village that had been staging raids into Texas. He'd burned everything, killed 19 warriors, took 40 prisoners. The raid was illegal, a violation of Mexican sovereignty, but it worked. The raid stopped. Washington looked the other way. Now, Mackenzie commanded the 4th Cavalry, 600 veteran troopers based at Fort Concho. They were arguably the best cavalry regiment in the Army. Disciplined, experienced, led by officers who'd survived the Civil War and countless skirmishes with hostile tribes. These weren't green recruits. They were professional soldiers who knew exactly what they were being asked to do. On September 20th, Mackenzie led his column northwest from Fort Concho, heading into the Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains. It was a landscape that had terrified white soldiers since the first Spanish explorers crossed it 300 years earlier. Flat, treeless, waterless. The sky went on forever, and the horizon offered no landmarks. Men got lost and died of thirst within sight of their own wagon tracks. The Comanche knew every water hole, every playa lake, every hidden spring. The Army didn't, but Mackenzie had an advantage: Tonkawa scouts. The Tonkawa hated the Comanche even more than the whites did. For generations, the Comanche had raided Tonkawa villages, killed their warriors, taken their women and children. The Tonkawa wanted revenge, and they knew the country almost as well as the Comanche did. One scout in particular would change everything. A Tonkawa named Job. Some sources called him Joboso. He'd scouted for Mackenzie before and proven reliable. On September 26th, 6 days into the march, Job rode back to Mackenzie with information that made the colonel's pulse quicken. He'd found them. The main Comanche encampment. Not just one band. Multiple bands together. Hundreds of lodges. Hidden in a massive canyon about 20 miles northeast of their current position. Palo Duro Canyon. Mackenzie knew the name. Every officer on the frontier knew it. The Comanche called it their sanctuary. A giant crack in the earth. 800 feet deep in places, with sheer red rock walls, and only a handful of trails down. The Spanish had known about it for centuries, but never tried to assault it. Too dangerous. Too easy to defend. One warrior at the top of those trails could hold off 100 soldiers. But Job told Mackenzie something crucial. He knew a trail the Comanche weren't guarding. A steep, narrow path on the canyon's east side. Dangerous, yes. Barely passable for horses. But it would get them down. And once they were on the canyon floor, the Comanche would be trapped. That night, September 26th, Mackenzie called his officers together. Captain Eugene Beaumont, Captain Sebastian Gunther, Lieutenant Henry Lawton, who would later become famous, hunting Geronimo, Captain Wirt Davis. These were experienced men, Indian fighters all, and they knew what Mackenzie was proposing was risky. If the Comanche discovered them on that trail, caught them strung out single file with nowhere to maneuver, it would be a slaughter. The 4th Cavalry could be wiped out. But Mackenzie had made his decision. They would march that night, 20 miles in darkness across the Staked Plains. They would reach the canyon before dawn, and at first light, they would descend. 600 men, 600 horses, down a trail barely wide enough for a single rider. It was madness, but it was also the chance to end the Comanche threat forever, to destroy the last free bands in a single stroke, to finish what the Army had been trying to accomplish for 30 years. The officers returned to their companies. Mackenzie's orders were clear. Wake the men at 0300. March in silence. No fires, no talking, no unnecessary noise. The Tonkawa scouts would lead. The cavalry would follow. When they reached the canyon, they would wait for dawn. Then they would attack. As the camp settled down for a few hours of sleep, Mackenzie sat alone outside his tent, staring into the darkness toward the north, toward Palo Duro Canyon. Somewhere out there, 20 miles away, hundreds of Comanche slept peacefully, believing they were safe in their ancient stronghold. They had no idea that by this time tomorrow, everything would be gone. Their lodges, their food, their horses, their freedom, their entire way of life. At 0300 on September 27th, the 4th Cavalry began to move. The march through the darkness was silent except for the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on dry earth. 600 cavalrymen moving across the Staked Plains under a sky so crowded with stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. No moon, just starlight. Cold air biting at exposed skin, promising that winter wasn't far away. The men rode hunched in their saddles, half asleep, trusting their horses to follow the mount ahead. Nobody spoke. Mackenzie's orders had been explicit. Silence. Complete silence. They reached the canyon rim just before dawn. Captain Eugene Beaumont, riding near the front with the Tonkawa scouts, was the first officer to see it. One moment they were crossing flat prairie. The next, the the earth simply ended. A massive crack in the ground, black and bottomless, in the pre-dawn darkness. He dismounted and crawled to the edge on his belly, peering down. Nothing. Just blackness and the faint sound of water running far below. The prairie dog town fork of the Red River. Somewhere down there, 800 feet down, the Comanche were sleeping. Mackenzie ordered the column to halt a quarter-mile back from the rim, out of sight. The men dismounted quietly, holding their horses' noses to keep them from nickering. Some of the soldiers crept forward to look down into the canyon. What they saw as the sky began to lighten made them catch their breath. The canyon was enormous, miles long, half a mile wide at the bottom. The walls glowed deep red, even in the dim light, layers of ancient stone stacked like a giant staircase. And down below, just becoming visible, the lodges, hundreds of them. White buffalo hide typists scattered along the canyon floor on both sides of the river. Cook fires beginning to glow as the village woke up, the thin smoke rising in straight columns in the still morning air. Lieutenant Robert Carter, who kept a detailed diary, would later write, quote, "Never before had I seen such a beautiful and wonderful sight as that which met our gaze in the dim morning light," end quote. Beautiful and deadly, because those lodges represented everything the 4th Cavalry had been hunting for months. 5 bands together in one place. Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne. Quanah Parker's Quahati were there. So were the Katsuteca under Blackbeard, the Yamparika, the Nokoni. Warriors who had never submitted to reservation life. Women and children who had never bowed to white authority. This was the last free concentration of Southern Plains Indians. All of them. Right there. Trapped at the bottom of a canyon with walls too steep to climb quickly. Job, the Tonkawa scout, led Mackenzie along the rim to the trail. It wasn't much, more of a crack in the rock face than a proper trail. Steep didn't begin to describe it. In places, it was nearly vertical. Loose shale and rock, barely 3 feet wide. One misstep and horse and rider would tumble 800 feet to the canyon floor. Mackenzie stared at it, calculating. 600 horses, single file. If the Comanche discovered them halfway down, caught them on that trail with nowhere to go, it would be a massacre. The 4th Cavalry would cease to exist. But the alternative was to let them go, to admit defeat, to accept that the Comanche would keep raiding, keep killing, keep terrorizing the frontier until there was nothing left of them but starving remnants. This was the opportunity. Right now, right here, Mackenzie turned to his officers. Quote, "We're going down," end quote. It was 0600 when the descent began. Dawn was breaking properly now. The sky turning from black to deep blue to pale orange. The temperature was maybe 40 degrees and dropping. Captain Beaumont led the first troop down, testing the trail. His horse balked at the edge, planted its feet, refused to move. Beaumont dismounted and led it by hand, talking softly, coaxing it forward. The animal's hooves skittered on loose rock. Once, twice, it nearly fell, and Beaumont's heart hammered in his chest. But they made it. 10 feet down, 20 feet. The walls of the canyon rising on both sides now, blocking out the sky. Behind him, more soldiers began the descent, leading their horses. Some of the animals panicked, rearing and squealing. One horse lost its footing and tumbled, screaming, bouncing off the rock face, once, twice, before hitting the bottom with a sickening crunch. The sound echoed up the canyon walls. Men froze, certain the Comanche would hear. But down below, the village continued its morning routine. Smoke from cook fires, the faint sound of voices, dogs barking, life going on as normal. The trail seemed to take forever. 30 minutes to descend 800 feet, soldiers cursing under their breath as rocks skittered out from under their boots, horses trembling with fear, their eyes rolling white, and all the while getting closer to the bottom, closer to the lodges, closer to the moment when someone would look up and see them and the alarm would sound. A Comanche boy spotted them first, maybe 10 years old, standing near the river, urinating into the water. He looked up at the wrong moment, saw the blue coats on the cliff face, saw the horses, saw the rifles. His mouth opened. He screamed a warning, one word in Comanche. Soldiers, everything happened at once. Warriors erupted from lodges, grabbing weapons. Women screamed, scooping up children. Dogs went insane, barking and snarling. And on the canyon walls, Mackenzie gave the order he'd been holding in his throat for the last half hour. Attack The cavalry troopers who'd already reached the bottom didn't wait for the rest. They mounted and charged. 60 men, maybe 80, galloping straight into a village of hundreds. The thunder of their horses' hooves echoed off the canyon walls, magnifying the sound, making it seem like thousands were coming. Captain Beaumont led the charge, his saber drawn, screaming the command. Forward, forward, forward. The Comanche were caught completely off guard. They'd posted sentries on some of the trails, but not this one. Nobody expected soldiers to come down that death trap of a path. Warriors ran from their lodges half-dressed, clutching rifles and bows, trying to organize a defense. But there was no time. The cavalry was already among them, horses crashing through the camp, sabers flashing, pistols firing at point-blank range. A Comanche warrior named Iron Mountain tried to rally his people. He stood in the center of the camp, firing a repeating rifle at the charging soldiers, his voice booming across the chaos. Stand and fight! Stand and fight! We are Comanche, we do not run. But even as he spoke, families were fleeing. Women carrying infants, old people stumbling toward the canyon's far end, children crying, lost in the smoke and confusion. The fighting was close and brutal. A private named George MacDonald found himself face to face with a warrior near one of the lodges. Both men had empty weapons. The warrior drew a knife. MacDonald clubbed him with his rifle butt, once, twice, the man's skull cracking under the impact. He fell and didn't move. MacDonald stumbled backward, retching the reality of what he'd just done, hitting him harder than any bullet. More cavalry reached the bottom. 2 troops now. 3. The narrow trail couldn't handle the volume, and soldiers were backing up at the top, desperate to get down to join the fight. Lieutenant Henry Lawton led his troop in a flanking maneuver, galloping up the canyon to cut off the fleeing Comanche. His horse splashed through the river, water spraying, and then they were among the lodges on the north side, carbines firing, the reports echoing and re-echoing until it sounded like a full-scale battle instead of a rout. A Comanche woman named Pease Mary stood outside her lodge with a rifle, firing methodically at the soldiers. She hit one in the shoulder, knocked him from his horse, reloaded, fired again, missed. A cavalry trooper charged her, intending to ride her down. She stood her ground, raised the rifle, aimed carefully. The trooper saw his death in her eyes, but his horse crashed into her before she could fire, sending her sprawling. She rolled, came up running, disappeared into the smoke and confusion. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted maybe 20 minutes of intense fighting before the Comanche defense collapsed completely. They couldn't hold against 600 soldiers. Not here, not trapped in the canyon. Warriors formed a rear guard, firing from cover, trying to give their families time to escape up the canyon. Some of them fought with incredible bravery. A warrior named Isatai, who'd been at Adobe Walls, charged directly at a line of cavalry troopers, screaming his death song, knowing he wouldn't survive. He killed 1 soldier, wounded another, before 4 carbine rounds cut him down. But most of the Comanche ran. Up the canyon, away from the soldiers. 3 miles, 5 miles. Scrambling up narrow side trails, climbing the steep walls, hand over hand, anything to get away from the guns and the horses and the blue coats who'd found their secret place. By 0700, the shooting had mostly stopped. The cavalry controlled the entire village, 243 lodges, stretching along 3 miles of canyon floor, and the Comanche were gone, scattered, fleeing into the breaks inside canyons, watching from the rims as the soldiers began their real work. Mackenzie's orders were simple: burn everything. Troopers moved through the camp systematically, torching each lodge. The buffalo hide covers burned reluctantly at first, smoldering, then caught with a roar. Inside were winter supplies: dried buffalo meat, pemmican, robes and blankets, clothing, tools, weapons, parfleches filled with personal belongings, medicine bundles, everything the Comanche needed to survive the coming winter, everything they owned in the world, all of it burning. Sergeant John Charlton described what he found in one lodge. Quote, "There were parfleches filled with fine clothing, beaded moccasins, buffalo robes so beautifully tanned they felt like velvet. There were shields decorated with feathers and paint, bows and arrows, several fine rifles, and bags of dried meat and berries. We burned it all. Orders were orders." End quote. The smoke rose in thick, black columns, visible for miles. Up on the canyon rims, the scattered Comanche watched their homes burn, their food burn, their belongings burn, everything, gone. Women wept. Warriors stood in silent rage, helpless to stop it. Some fired rifles at the soldiers below, but at that range the shots were ineffective, the bullets just kicking up dust near the lodges. By noon, every lodge was destroyed. The canyon floor looked like a battlefield. Smoke hanging in the air, ashes swirling. The river running past the charred remains of what had been a thriving village just 6 hours earlier, and sprawled throughout the destruction, the Comanche casualties. Historians disagree on the exact number. Mackenzie's official report claimed only 4 Comanche were killed, 1 soldier wounded. But Comanche oral histories tell a different story. They say dozens died. Warriors who fought to the last, old people who couldn't flee fast enough, children who got separated from their families and were trampled in the chaos. One soldier, Private Frederick Platten, years later admitted what really happened. Quote, "We killed more than the official report says. I saw women and children cut down. I saw wounded warriors shot where they lay. Nobody wanted to talk about it afterward. Nobody wanted to admit what we'd done," end quote. But Mackenzie wasn't finished. The lodges and supplies were destroyed, yes. But the Comanche could rebuild. They could hunt buffalo, get more meat, make new lodges. They'd done it before. As long as they had their horses, they could survive, they could raid, they could remain free. Mackenzie understood this better than anyone. The horses were the key. The source of Comanche power. Their mobility. Their wealth. Their identity. Without horses, the Comanche were just pedestrians on a plains that stretched 1,000 miles in every direction. Without horses, they were finished. The cavalry spent the afternoon rounding up the Comanche horse herd. It was a massive undertaking. The horses were scattered throughout the canyon, hidden in side draws, running loose along the river. But slowly, methodically, the troopers gathered them. 1,424 horses and mules. Every animal the 5 bands owned. The source of their freedom, they drove the herd out of the canyon that evening, September 28th, using the same trail they descended that morning. It took hours. The horses resisted, not wanting to climb. But the soldiers persisted, driving them up and up until they emerged onto the plains above. And there they made camp, the horse herd under heavy guard, while Mackenzie decided what to do with them. Some of his officers argued for keeping the horses. They were valuable. The army could use them, or sell them. There was money to be made. But Mackenzie understood something his officers didn't. If they kept the horses, the Comanche would try to take them back. They'd follow the cavalry, harass them, attack at night, do anything to reclaim their most precious possession. The only way to truly break the Comanche was to take away any hope of recovery. On October 1st, 3 days after the battle, Mackenzie gave the order that would haunt some of his men for the rest of their lives. Kill them. Kill all the horses. The soldiers couldn't believe it. These were beautiful animals, strong, well-trained, worth a fortune, and they were being ordered to slaughter them like cattle. But orders were orders. The shooting began at dawn. Soldiers with carbines formed a line. The horses were driven forward in small groups, and they were shot, one by one, group by group. The sound of gunfire echoed across the Stake Plains for hours. Horses screaming, falling, blood soaking into the dry earth. Private Frederick Platten, the same soldier who'd admitted to killing women and children in the canyon, wrote about the horse slaughter years later. Quote, "It was the worst thing I ever had to do in my life. Worse than any battle. The horses didn't understand. They just stood there looking at us while we shot them. Some of the men were crying. I was crying. But we kept shooting because Colonel Mackenzie said we had to, because that's what it took to end the Comanche," end quote. By the time it was over, more than 1,000 horses lay dead on the plains. A few hundred were kept for the cavalry's use, given to the Tonkawa scouts, or saved for trading. But the vast majority were killed. The largest horse slaughter in the history of the Indian Wars. Up on distant ridges, the Comanche watched. They saw the smoke from the burning lodges. They heard the gunfire from the horse massacre. They understood what it meant. Without horses, they couldn't hunt buffalo, couldn't raid, couldn't travel the great distances necessary to survive on the plains. They couldn't be Comanche anymore. Quanah Parker stood on a ridge overlooking the scene, surrounded by the remnants of his Quahati band. Warriors who'd fought beside him for years. Families who'd never submitted to reservation life. They had nothing now. No lodges, no food, no horses. Winter was coming. The buffalo were nearly gone, and the army would keep hunting them, keep pursuing them, until there was nothing left. Quote, "We can't fight them anymore," end quote, Quanah said to the men around him. Quote, "Not this way. Not without horses, not without supplies. Maybe we can survive this winter, but next winter, the winter after that, they will keep coming. They will never stop," end quote. One of the warriors spat on the ground. Quote, "Then we die fighting," end quote. Quanah shook his head. Quote, "We die either way. But if we surrender, maybe our children live. Maybe they remember who we were," end quote. It would take 8 more months. 8 months of hiding in the breaks and canyons, starving, freezing, watching their children grow thin and weak. 8 months of being hunted by soldiers who never stopped, never rested, never showed mercy. But in June of 1875, Quanah Parker would lead 400 Quahati Comanche to Fort Sill and surrender. The last free band, the last free chief, the end of everything. But that end really happened in Palo Duro Canyon on September 28, 1874, when the lodges burned, when the horses died, when the Comanche realized that their time was over. The battle itself had been almost bloodless. A few Comanche killed, 1 soldier wounded. Hardly worth mentioning in the long history of Indian wars. But the aftermath broke them, destroyed their ability to resist, ended 150 years of Comanche dominance on the southern plains. Mackenzie's official report was matter of fact. Quote, "Destroyed 243 lodges and winter supplies. Captured 1,424 horses and mules. Enemies scattered and demoralized. Mission successful," end quote. Successful. That was one word for it. Another word was devastating. Another was final. The Comanche would never recover. The survivors of Palo Duro Canyon scattered across the Texas Panhandle like leaves in a winter wind. Small bands, families, sometimes just individuals, walking because they had no horses, carrying what little they'd managed to grab before the soldiers came. A blanket, a knife, maybe a handful of dried meat. Nothing else. Everything they owned had burned in those lodges or been left behind in the chaos. October turned cold. Then November brought the first serious freeze. The Comanche had no shelter. They dug pits in the ground and covered them with brush, huddling together for warmth. They ate roots and bark, killed their dogs for meat. Some starved, the old ones mostly, and the very young. You could track the fleeing bands by the tiny graves they left behind. And still the army came after them. That was the genius of Sheridan's strategy. Give them no rest, no time to recover, no chance to regroup. Colonel Nelson Miles attacked a Cheyenne camp on McClellan Creek in early November, burning 70 log homes and capturing the entire horse herd. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson hit a Kiowa camp near the Washita River in late November. More lodges burned, more supplies destroyed. The noose kept tightening. By December, small groups started surrendering at Fort Sill. Starving, sick, desperate. They came in holding white flags made from torn shirts, leading children who could barely walk. The army fed them, gave them blankets, put them on the reservation, and made sure they understood there would be no going back. The soldiers kept their weapons, counted them daily, watched them constantly. The Quahati, under Quanah Parker, held out the longest. They were the most defiant, the most committed to the old ways. Through the winter of 1874 and into the spring of 1875, they survived in the breaks and canyons of the Llano Estacado, hunting the last buffalo, avoiding the army patrols, growing weaker every day. Quanah watched his people waste away, watched children die from hunger and cold, watched the warriors lose the fire in their eyes and become hollow men, ghosts of what they'd been. In May of 1875, Quanah sent word to Fort Sill. He wanted to talk, wanted terms. The reply came back swift and harsh. There were no terms. Unconditional surrender. Come in or be hunted until there was no one left. On June 2nd, 1875, Quanah Parker led 400 Quahati Comanche to Fort Sill, the last free band, the last war chief who'd never signed a treaty. They rode in on worn-out horses borrowed from reservation Indians, moving slowly, heads down. No war songs, no defiant gestures. Just exhausted people who'd finally accepted that the world had changed and they couldn't change it back. A soldier watching them arrive wrote in his diary, quote, "They looked like they'd ridden out of hell, skin and bones, most of them. Children with distended bellies from starvation. Warriors who could barely sit their horses. I felt sorry for them. These were the people who'd terrorized Texas for 30 years. Now they looked like beggars," end quote. The Red River War was over. The final tally was remarkably one-sided. 14 major engagements. Fewer than 20 Comanche warriors killed in actual combat. Maybe a dozen soldiers killed. But that wasn't the point. The point was the systematic destruction of everything the Comanche needed to survive. 2,500 horses killed or captured. Thousands of lodges burned. Hundreds of tons of winter supplies destroyed. By the time the war ended, nearly every free Comanche on the southern plains was either dead or on the reservation. The numbers tell the story. At their peak in the 1820s, the Comanche probably numbered around 20,000. By 1875, the reservation rolls showed roughly 8,000. Some had died in battle over the decades, many more from cholera, smallpox, and other diseases brought by white contact. But thousands had simply vanished, absorbed into other tribes or Mexican communities, or died alone on the plains where nobody counted them. The buffalo were gone too. Professional hunters, like the ones at Adobe Walls, had killed 3.5 million buffalo in just 3 years. By 1878, the great southern herd was extinct. The vast prairies that had sustained the Comanche for generations were empty. Within a decade, those same prairies would be fenced and plowed, turned into farms and ranches by settlers who'd feared the Comanche moon just a few years earlier. William Leckey writes in his book, The Military Conquest of the Southern Plains, quote, "The Comanche were not defeated by superior numbers or better tactics. They were defeated by the systematic destruction of their economic base. Without horses and buffalo, they could not be Comanche." The army understood this. That's why Palo Duro was so devastating. It didn't matter how many warriors died. What mattered was that their way of life died, end quote. Life on the reservation was everything the free Comanche had feared. Government rations of beef and flour distributed weekly, like charity. Pressure to farm, to become sedentary, to abandon everything that made them who they were. Christian missionaries arrived, eager to save Comanche souls, teaching children to be ashamed of their heritage. The traditional raids, the source of warrior, prestige, and tribal wealth, were forbidden. Men who'd been feared across the Southwest sat idle, drinking the whiskey traders, sold them, mourning the past. Some adapted. Quanah Parker became the most successful of them. He learned English, wore white man's clothes, became a judge on the reservation court. He invested in cattle ranching and became wealthy by reservation standards. He advocated for his people's rights, traveled to Washington to meet with presidents. He walked the impossible line between two worlds, Comanche enough to keep his people's respect, American enough to navigate the white man's system. But Quanah never forgot what had been lost. In his later years, he spoke often of the old days, the buffalo hunts, the raids, the absolute freedom of the plains. He told his children and grandchildren stories so they would remember, so they would know that the Comanche had once been the most powerful tribe in North America, lords of an empire that stretched from Kansas to Mexico. In 1911, Quanah Parker died at age 66. Thousands attended his funeral, both Indian and white. They buried him in full Comanche regalia, the clothes he would have worn as a war chief in the old days. But they buried him in a Christian cemetery at Fort Sill, surrounded by the graves of U.S. soldiers. Even in death, he existed between two worlds. The Comanche nation survived. Exists today, in fact, with headquarters in Lawton, Oklahoma. Thousands of enrolled members, cultural programs teaching the language, the traditions, the history, but they're not raiders anymore. Not nomads, not the terror of the plains. That Comanche died at Palo Duro Canyon when Mackenzie's troopers came down that cliff face at dawn and burned everything the people needed to remain free. Historian Pekka Hämäläinen writes, quote, "The Comanche Empire collapsed with stunning speed. From 1850 to 1875, just 25 years, they went from being the dominant power on the southern plains to reservation wards of the federal government. No other Native American tribe fell so far so fast," end quote. Palo Duro Canyon is a Texas state park now. Tourists hike the trails where Comanche families once fled for their lives. Camp where the lodges burned. Take pictures of the red rock walls that echoed with gunfire that September morning. There's a historical marker describing the battle. It's matter-of-fact, clinical. Quote, Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie defeated a large encampment of hostile Indians here on September 28, 1874. The victory marked the beginning of the end of Indian resistance in Texas, end quote. Defeated, victory, resistance, sanitized words for what really happened. The systematic destruction of a people's ability to exist as they had for generations. The deliberate breaking of an entire culture's spirit by burning their homes and killing their horses and hunting them through a brutal winter until they had no choice but to surrender or die. Was it necessary? Could the Comanche and white settlers have coexisted peacefully? Could negotiations have worked where military force succeeded? Those questions have no easy answers. The Comanche were brutal raiders who'd terrorized the frontier for decades. They'd killed hundreds, maybe thousands, of settlers. They'd taken captives, burned homes, left families, destroyed. They weren't innocent victims. But neither were they mindless savages. They were people defending their land, their way of life, against an invasion they couldn't stop. Both sides believed they were right. Both sides committed atrocities. And in the end, the side with more soldiers and better weapons and the willingness to wage total war won. That's what happened at Palo Duro Canyon. Not a battle, not a victory, an ending. There's a photograph from 1901 that captures something essential about what was lost at Palo Duro Canyon. It shows Quanah Parker sitting on a porch in a three-piece suit, looking directly at the camera with eyes that have seen both worlds. Beside him stands a young Comanche woman in a Victorian dress. Behind them, visible through the window, you can see the interior of his house. Comfortable, American, civilized. And on the wall hangs a buffalo hide shield, painted with symbols of power and protection, a relic from another life. That photograph is the Comanche story in a single frame. Survival through adaptation, but also loss. Profound, irreversible loss. What happened at Palo Duro Canyon wasn't unique in American history. The same pattern repeated across the continent. Negotiate, conflict, military solution, reservation. The Cherokee experienced it on the Trail of Tears. The Lakota at Wounded Knee. The Nez Perce during their desperate flight toward Canada. The Apache under Geronimo. Every tribe that resisted American expansion eventually faced the same choice: submit or be destroyed. But the Comanche fought longer and harder than most. For 150 years, they dominated the southern plains through superior horsemanship, tactical brilliance, and absolute refusal to compromise. They weren't defeated in a single great battle like the Lakota at Little Bighorn. They were defeated by the systematic destruction of everything that allowed them to be Comanche. The horses, the buffalo, the freedom to move across land they'd considered theirs by right of conquest. Historian S.C. Gwynn writes, quote, "The Comanche story is ultimately a tragedy, not because they lost, all defeated peoples lose, but because what they lost was irreplaceable. A way of life that had sustained them for generations disappeared in less than a decade. Their children would know of it only through stories," end quote. And yet the Comanche endured. Not as they were, but as they became. The language survived. The traditions adapted. The people remembered. Today, Comanche Nation citizens work as teachers, lawyers, doctors, artists. They serve in the U.S. military. They participate in American democracy. But they also hold powwows, teach their children the old stories, fight to preserve what remains of their heritage. They exist in that same impossible space where Quanah Parker stood. Between worlds, between what was and what is. Perhaps the real lesson of Palo Duro Canyon isn't about military strategy or manifest destiny or the inevitable march of civilization. Perhaps it's about the human cost of incompatible visions colliding. The Comanche saw the plains as hunting grounds, meant to be moved across freely, resources taken as needed. The settlers saw the same land as property, meant to be owned, fenced, cultivated. Both believed they were right. Both believed they were defending what was theirs. And when those beliefs crashed into each other, the side with more people and more guns and more willingness to wage total war prevailed. That's not a moral judgment. It's just what happened. History isn't about heroes and villains. It's about people making choices with consequences they couldn't fully understand. Colonel Mackenzie believed he was ending decades of frontier violence and bringing peace to Texas. He was right. The Comanche believed they were defending their homeland and their way of life against invaders. They were right too. Both things can be true. What we owe them now, all of them, Comanche and soldier alike, is to remember what actually happened. Not a sanitized version, not a story with easy answers, but the truth that on September 28th, 1874, 600 U.S. cavalry troopers descended into Palo Duro Canyon and ended an empire. That they did it by destroying homes and killing horses and pursuing families through a brutal winter until surrender was the only option. That it worked. And that it cost something we can never get back. The buffalo are gone from those plains. The great Comanche horse herds are gone. The lodges and the raids and the absolute freedom of a nomadic life are gone. But the people remain. Changed, adapted, surviving, still Comanche, still here. Maybe that's the real victory. Not Mackenzie's, not the Army's, but the Comanche's own victory over a history that tried to erase them completely. Thanks for watching Valor and Violence. If this story resonated with you, we've got another video exploring Quanah Parker's remarkable transformation from the last free Comanche war chief to one of the most influential Native American leaders in history. It's a story of adaptation, compromise, and the impossible choices people make when their world ends. What do you think? Could the Comanche and settlers have found a way to coexist? Was the Red River War inevitable, or could different choices have led to different outcomes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. History is complicated, and the conversation about how we remember it matters. If you have questions or want to suggest topics for future videos, let us know. We read every comment. Until next time, remember that understanding the past means facing its uncomfortable truths. Thanks for watching.